What's up, folks? Today is the day we are sharpening a knife today. I want to get into busting a few myths I was told when I was first starting off sharpening my own knives. The only two things that matter when you're whetstone sharpening, and then give a little bit about care and maintenance to finish the job. Thank you so much for your attention. My name's Justin Khanna. So right off the bat, if you're watching this video first, there are prequel videos to this that you should definitely watch before you come back and watch this video. In those videos, I talk about sharpness, how to tell if your knife is sharp or not, as well as all the gear that we're gonna be using in this video. But if I missed anything, that's gonna be linked up in my kit page down in the description, but you guys already knew that. Sharpening your knife, it's caveman stuff, folks. It's rubbing a tool up against a rock, but it's technical AF. People go really deep into this topic, and I get it. There's geometry and particles and pressure and physics, but what I care about is having knives that are sharp enough to make me feel like a badass and durable enough to last me through the whole week, and getting there in the least amount of time. And that's why I've settled on this way of whetstone sharpening. Setting up, I put my stones up and down in a vertical orientation in front of me. You can use that knife stand I mentioned. You can buy or make your own sink bridge, or even you can just put a towel under whatever stones you have. Putting your stones in this vertical orientation means you have the time to focus on two things, the only two things that matter in whetstone knife sharpening, and that's angle and pressure. If you can nail those two things, I would argue that's 80 to 90% of the job. That's the hardest part in knife sharpening. So let's break that down. Angles. Everyone loves to talk about their angles. Bro, is that a 50-50? Yo, I just got this sick knife that's a 70-30. And then there's, of course, the Japanese knife gearheads that are just sitting at 90-10 and laughing at everyone else. And yes, that has to do with angles to a certain extent, but it's not the actual angle that they're sharpening at. And this took me a minute to wrap my head around. Those numbers have to deal with percentages, and notice they always add up to 100. So let's not get it twisted. The angle is the actual positioning of your knife in relation to the stone, how much tilt it has when you're sharpening. Remember how important it is to have a flat stone. Blade ratio, on the other hand, has to deal with where the blade is on the knife. And to explain that, I'm going to use something that we've all used before, and that is a mandolin. So a lot of people don't know this, but you can actually sharpen your mandolin. You just have to take the blades out. It's just as simple as taking these screws out. This is a larger version, so the screws are on the top. I think on the smaller ones, the screws are on the bottom. And boom, it's off. So I love using the mandolin as an example because we all know how a mandolin works. And if you do want to do that offset ratio, your knife should be exactly the same. This mandolin is a 90-10 or a 95-5, whatever you want to call it. The blade is on this side. There's no blade on this side. This is just a flat piece of metal. And if you look at where the blade is when the mandolin is being used, it's like that. The blade side is on the underneath side of the mandolin. That blade side is on the opposite side of where the food touches when you're all squared up. Does that make sense? Use this potato as an example. The side with the smaller percentage is touching the food when I'm squared up. So my blade, for me, I'm right-handed. My blade is on this side, which if I'm holding the knife in front of me, spine up, it's the right side of the knife. We will call this side the blade side of the knife for reference going forward. And if you're left-handed, it just changes. It just goes to the opposite. So I personally do most of my knives in this offset ratio. I can't tell you if it's exactly 70-30 or 60-40 or 80-20, but it's something you can experiment with and do with your own knives. But why would you want an offset ratio? A 50-50 blade looks like this. The knife comes down. Once it gets to a tip, there's an equal ratio of blade on both sides of the knife. And this leads to being the most durable edge you can have on your knife. The problem with it is because they're knives and the cutting edge is so thin, you need to make room for both blades on this knife. So you end up with this kind of beefy blade, which is great for durability, but it's not really that thin. And the thinner a blade is, technically speaking, the sharper it is. Taking it to the other side of the spectrum, a 90-10 ratio looks similar to this, where there's virtually no blade on one side, and the blade is almost entirely on the other side of the knife. This is what our mandolin looks like. And that's why harder, high-quality steel is so regarded, because as you get up into those 90-10 ratio blades, the steel needs to be hard enough to withstand that abuse going through food and hitting the cutting board. Because as you can see, over time, the blade gets pushed to this side of the knife. And this curve is called a burr. You'll be able to feel it on some of your knives. And as that blade starts to curve, as that burr gets wider and wider and theoretically less thin, the knife becomes dull. And when we're sharpening, technically what we're doing is removing that steel, reshaping the blade. And that's why you'll often see the mud on the surface of the stone, which is just a mixture of water, actual steel from the knife, and the stone itself. So the reason I sharpen my knives in this offset ratio is to get the best of both worlds. It has the durability to last me through the whole week, but it's thin enough to get the performance that I want. Harder steel will help you get a longer lasting edge if your ratio helps facilitate that. Like, you can get a crazy sharp 90-10 edge on a really crappy low quality knife, but the steel won't be hard enough to hold that edge, and that just kind of defeats the purpose. So you've decided what ratio you want to go for. Now let's talk about the angles. And a good frame of reference for that, if you're here in the US or have access to them, is pennies. There are tools and attachments to buy if you want help with your angles, but the way that I do it, the way that I learned, and the way that I still do it with my knives, I start with 2 pennies, that's my lower percentage side, flip the knife, 3 pennies, that's my blade side. And you're obviously not going to drag the pennies with you as you perform passes on the stone. I stack the pennies and then use my thumb on my right hand to feel where that is. And I literally make sure my thumb maintains contact with the knife spine and the stone. My finger will literally be bleeding after a few knives, and it sounds all macho, but once you get this muscle memory down, you're set for life. 2 pennies, I do 3 passes. I put the pennies back and see where I'm at. Then I adjust it, do 3 more passes, and then I'll flip it onto the blade side. Remember, that's 3 pennies high. I use my index finger of my right hand to feel where this is instead of my thumb. Same deal. I do 3 passes, hashtag check the pennies, and repeat. With the way I have my stone set up, I limit the plane where my knife can go. It can only go forward and back, and then tilt up and down. Some people like to go side to side, and if that works for you, great. But when you're just starting off, it's best to limit those factors that can cause problems, which is why I preach flat stones and vertical orientation. It takes a little bit, but once you get this down, now we can talk about the other principle of knife sharpening: pressure. Lower grit stones, that is between the 200 and 900 grit range. That's where you're applying the most pressure and the least number of passes. My left hand is in charge of the pressure, and the position matters. It moves. Your fingers are always pushing down into the stone, and they move along the blade depending on where that point of contact is. It's a downwards motion that your fingers provide, and the forward and back comes from your elbows. Your right hand is just along for the ride, and it's controlling the angle, the tilt of the knife. It's really important to never let the knife cut into the stone depending on the way that you're going with your pressure. A good way I like to remember it is pressure happens in the direction of the spine. So on the blade side for me, that's pushing, and on the other side, that's pulling. But when you're backtracking to reset before you push or pull, you don't have to lose that friction. You can still push it up against the stone, just don't apply so much pressure. You still with me? Now there are a few principles to keep in mind that are semi-common sense as the grits change. You don't want to grind a ton of steel off, but you want to press hard enough to get that edge started. Don't go crazy here, and depending on the grit of the stone, it's between 5 and 10 passes on each side of the knife. The pressure you're applying should not affect the angle that you're holding the knife. Use your pennies, and remember, left hand controls the pressure, right hand controls the angle. This is also a really good time to feel for that burr that we talked about before, because as you start to grind down one side of the knife, you're pushing steel up towards the other side. Also, depending on the size of the knife here, I like to break them up into zones, whether it's heel, middle, and tip. Maybe if it's a smaller knife, I'll just break it up into heel and tip. There are some other advanced techniques you can do as you get to the tip of certain knives, but that will be discussed in the advanced techniques video. Okay, so now we're on to the 1000 grit stone. This is going to be where the majority of your work gets done. The grit is high enough so that you're not rubbing off way too much steel on the knife, but it's low enough to where you can actually start to shape the edge. In the spectrum of pressure, this is right in the middle. You're not going crazy, but you're not babying it either. It's the kind of pressure you push down when you're cleaning your electronic screens. Got it? So in this stage, the way that you know to move on to the next one is to use that burr detecting technique. And when it's either really, really small or completely gone, you can go on to the next one. I'll normally do 10 to 15 passes on one side, flip it, 10 to 15 passes, rinse and repeat. Now we're gonna go on to the 3000 grit stone. Pressure goes down, reps go down. This is just a natural progression as we get higher in grit. Your edge has a shape now, and if you put a crazy amount of pressure on the blade, it's actually gonna be more destructive than it's gonna be polishing. So take your pressure down by about 30%. The burr is probably gone now. You might not be able to feel it, and that's okay. You can use my fingernail test to see where the sharp areas are on the knife. Check the blade from heel to tip. If you see any areas that need a little bit more love, don't do anything on the 3000 grit stone. Go back to the 1000 grit stone, give it some love, and then go back up to 3000. 3000 grit done, and remember, the finer you get the edge on these knives, the more dainty they will be. So I actually stop a couple of my knives on the 3000 grit stone. Korin does technically classify 3000 as a finishing stone, but for all of your knives that are hard enough that you want to take higher, let's bust out the 6000 grit stone. And this part is fast. It's just polishing. You aren't shaping the edge here. You're just making sure the knife is nice and clean. All of the burrs are gone, and you're actually helping get a mirror finish on the knife, which just screams sharp. So I've mentioned this before, when I sharpen, I do all my knives at the same time, and I do it like plating. I don't do one dish start to finish and then do the next one. I do all my knives on the lower grit, then I bust out the 1000, 3000, 6000. There's a couple finishing techniques you can do now. Some people like newspaper, some people do leather strops. I personally like using a soft wood like the one that I use to make my sink bridge with. I just run the blade of the knife up against that, and it collects all the little tiny pieces of metal that are still stuck on the knife. You definitely don't want that in your prep. Next up, I'll do any other bits of care if necessary. If my knife has any rust on it, I will use this handy dandy eraser just to get rid of that. These are kind of a must if you have a carbon knife. It's just an abrasive that gets rid of the rust for like $8, I think. This one is actually called a super eraser. This one I bought a long time ago for my white ceramic honing rod. This takes all of the little steel bits off of that to return it to its beautiful white glory. And I found it coincidentally works as well as a rust eraser. Lastly, if it is a carbon knife, I will use some camellia oil, just do a couple drops on that, lube it up, and it's good to go. I'll run it all along the knife, the blade, the heel, as well as where it inserts into the handle and underneath. So there you have it, my definitive guide to knife sharpening technique. If you do something different and think it would bring value to everyone, I encourage you to leave it down in the comments. I'm always down to learn new stuff as well. I am very aware that I am not the end-all be-all of knife sharpening knowledge, so I encourage you to do even more research and find what works best for you. But if anything, I hope this gets you onto a stone and learning. It's very similar to a hollandaise sauce. You can read about it all day long, but until you get your hands on it, that's when you really start to learn. Everything's linked up below if you're interested in leveling up your setup or if you want to support this channel. Next video in this series is going to be all about advanced techniques and fixing busted blades. Until next time, my name's Justin Khanna. Have a good one.